Welcome back to our channel. We want to thank you for watching. When the French president Emmanuel Macron said colonialism was a crime against humanity, I think a lot of people thought he was joking, but he was simply saying that it was a crime against humanity because the huge impact that colonialism had in the continent of Africa, all of the issues we see happening at the moment, the impact, the disengagement with France, and a whole lot of other pushback that several countries are receiving from the continent of Africa, it stems back to the colonial history. A number of people will say that colonialism is over, time has passed, let's move on. Of course, countries have moved on. However, it is important to note the impact of this particular colonial era on what it has today. Let me take you back to the Berlin Conference. For those of you who don't know what the Berlin Conference is, let me read this. The Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 was a meeting of colonial powers that concluded with the signing of the General Act of Berlin, an agreement regulating European colonization and trade in Africa during the new imperialism period. That's an important perspective regards to that particular conference. It gave that opportunity for the colonial powers to reshape the continent of Africa. This has huge impact to the continent of Africa, its culture, its people. There are some African people who live from one country and their families are living across the border. Colonialism has a huge impact. Even the French president himself, Emmanuel Macron, came out clear to agree that a number of the multilateral institutions today, the United Nations, other organizations that have been formed, financial institutions, are not in the interest of the continent of Africa.
Here, I was very upset by this narrative of double standard. And a lot of leaders in this world said to us, you have a lot of billions for Ukraine, but when the question is to fix poverty, climate change, climate vulnerability in our country, it takes years or decades to find a few millions. This is quite true. I think we are right to do what we are doing for Ukraine because we are fighting for international law, for our liberty and our principles, and for a country being aggressed. But let's be clear, we were not sufficiently efficient vis-à-vis the South and a lot of countries facing poverty and climate change at the same time. So we have to address this narrative of double standard, otherwise it will be used by some others to create an alternative multilateral order. New financial institutions, new global order, and to say World Bank, IMF, even United Nations are no more efficient to fix our big issues, let's create something else. This is the number one reason for me, this forum, gathering from the US to China, to South Africa, Brazil, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, the Europeans and so on, a lot of countries, very poor to very rich, to build together a new consensus. The second objective of this summit is precisely to fix a new consensus. Because we created our financial institutions in a world where more than half of this country didn't exist. They are not fairly represented. And at that time, the challenge was not at the magnitude they are facing.
Folks, listen. Colonialism was a crime against humanity. I agree with the French president with this regard. It is important to note that the Berlin Conference itself had extremely huge significance in the deterioration of the growth of the continent in several areas. Others will say that this has passed. Yes, there were a number of consequences with regards to this particular conference. For example, if you really want to understand the Berlin Conference impact, one thing is clear. The Berlin Conference established the legal claim by Europeans that all of Africa could be occupied by whosoever could take it. It also established a process for Europeans to cooperate rather than fight with each other. This cooperation played a huge role in the division and conquest of the continent of Africa. This is vital. When the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck and the Belgian King Leopold at the time called the Berlin Conference, they were not joking. It was an important time and the transition for the continent of Africa. It has a tremendous impact. That's the reason why in Germany today, the Berlin Conference is having a huge impact and the story is not going anywhere soon. That's the reason why a number of African activists, wherever they are, the impact of this particular conference have impact on the financial system, the collaboration aspect, the engagement with the continent of Africa, the African infrastructural development and growth. A number of countries in the cultural aspect in the continent of Africa were impacted tremendously as a result of this conference. That's the reason why in Germany, this is taking a whole full different turn. Let's roll the clip from GWTV regards their perspective on the impact of this Berlin Conference in the continent of Africa.
How did one conference reshape an entire continent's destiny for generations to come? 140 years ago, European powers got together here in Berlin to decide on the rules of engagement as they claimed territory in Africa. Germany's Chancellor Otto von Bismarck called the Berlin Conference at the request of Belgium's King Leopold II, who wanted the Congo Basin as his private property. The so-called scramble for Africa by the Europeans often led to disputes between them, but the Berlin Conference provided a platform to iron out those issues. However, no indigenous African representatives attended the negotiations. African leaders had no say in what was happening to their homelands. Meanwhile, the Berlin Conference gave a boost to the European seizure of African land and resources, blatantly disregarding African sovereignty and leading to the reshaping of the continent's borders, societies, and future. Now, Germany has long promoted what's known here as memory culture. It's culture of remembrance, in reference particularly to the atrocities of the Nazi era. But its history with Africa hardly features. Now, activists are looking back at the 1884 Berlin Conference and its aftermath through a series of events and exhibitions to examine this crucial event. I went to have a look.
According to the author of Africa is Not a Country, it is important to dive into the reason why a number of people call an entire continent Africa. This stems with regards to the Berlin Conference and the review and the view of the continent of Africa. This notion that a continent with over 50 nations is just called Africa as if it is the way it should be called is problematic in the eyes of a number of officials and also African nationals themselves. This is important to also note that as a result of this conference, Africa was carved in such a way that it is not a representation of itself.
The Berlin Conference of 1884-85 was, even when it happened, very consequential for the African continent, and it continues to be so, simply because the consequences, the repercussions of it have been ignored broadly in Germany. You know, number one is obviously the fact of anti-black racism. So colonialism has not entered the memory culture in Europe or in Germany broadly, and that's why we're here.
It is important to have such an event to talk about, you know, the legacies of the Congo Conference or of the Berlin Conference, to talk about the violences that still go on, to talk about neo-colonialism, and also to inform ourselves and to learn from each other about where do we see colonialism in issues like trade, in issues like international development and issues of aid and so on and so forth.
According to the author of Africa is not a country, who clearly went out and elaborate on regards to the Berlin Conference. He talked about some very vital issues regards to this particular conference, on how it has impacted the continent of Africa. Let's listen to the conversation in regards to the impact of Berlin Conference and how, from the author's own perspective, the Berlin Conference has shaped the continent of Africa. Let's roll the clip.
I'm now joined by Dikpo Faloyin, journalist and author of the book Africa is Not a Country. Welcome to the program, Dikpo. Now, in your book, you make the link between the colonial era and its impact today. When you look back at this Berlin Conference and 140 years on, how would you sum up this kind of commemoration, if we were to describe it that way?
Yeah, I think for me, and thank you for having me today, I think for me the most important thing is using this as an opportunity to remember what happened at the Berlin Conference and how it has impacted the foundations of modern Africa. I think it goes beyond simply just commemorating this event and acknowledging it happened, but ensuring that going forward, this event is at the core of what we teach young people about the history of colonialism and the impact that that had on the 54 countries across Africa. I think there's such a misunderstanding of the importance of this event. A lot of people just assume that it simply was an event in which colonial powers came together and chose which parts of Africa they wanted, but actually that isn't the case. What actually happened was that they set about a series of rules that would go about how they would carve up the continent. And also importantly, they created these myths and stereotypes about Africa as being savages and uncivilized people with uncivilized communities, this idea of a dark continent. And so for me, the really, really essential thing is ensuring that, this remembrance is an opportunity for us to actually inject into our schools and into our common society an opportunity to learn more about the realities of what the Berlin Conference did and the impact that colonialism has had across the continent.
The Berlin Conference is not the best of all regards to Africa's history. The impact of the Berlin Conference will continue to haunt the people of the continent of Africa. A lot of experts will say the period has passed. Africa needs to move forward. Africa should engage and get developed and do other things. Yes, the multilateral institutions, the financial institutions, the big organizations like the United Nations, and all of these Bretton Woods institutions and the rest around the world were formed when Africa, a number of countries, were not countries themselves. And these institutions have decided to stay the way they are at the moment. And they are not showing any sign of changing or giving room or to revise the systems. And you say that a continent that over 50 countries were not in existence at the time, and these institutions were formed, and you think there is an equal playing field. I think it's the biggest injustice that still needs to be addressed.
Before we go into sort of the legacy, how would you respond to people who see this kind of conversation and say, well, that happened so long in the past, we need to move on?
Yeah, so, I think for me, the most important thing is understanding our history is key so we don't make the same mistakes looking into the future. And that has been one of the problems with this discussion, is that we do not understand the history. And so therefore we keep making the same mistakes currently. And, we see a lot of evidence that we're going to keep making the same mistakes into the future. We keep talking about Africa as if it's one big country. We keep talking about Africa as if it's a place that people can simply just go in and take from it whatever they like. We keep talking about Africa in the way in which the colonialists talked about Africa as a place of people who couldn't look after themselves and who were helpless and have no agency of their own. And so that is why these conversations are important. It's not simply, a historical discussion. It's a current modern discussion. It's essential to our understanding of the ongoing conversations around returning stolen artifacts, for example. All these things are linked together. And so it's not simply just something that happened 140 years ago. A lot of the legacies of that conference and what ensued speaks to our current present reality. And that's why it's really essential for me that as many people as possible understand the realities of the Berlin Conference and the impact that it's had on African countries to this day.
Can you break some of that down for us? Some of the impacts, whether social, cultural, or whatever else, as a result of the Berlin Conference that we're still seeing to this day?
Yeah, absolutely. And so as I mentioned earlier, one of the first things that the attendees at the conference did was that they decided to come up with a myth to justify going in and stealing the land for themselves. They had sent explorers into the regions who told them that Africa was a wonderful place full of incredible communities and natural resources and artifacts. And so after deciding that they were going to go in and steal the land and steal these artifacts for themselves and rule over these people, they knew that they needed to come up with some sort of justification as to why they should be allowed to do it. And so they came up with the myths that Africans were savages, uncivilized people who couldn't look after themselves. And so as a result, the colonialists were coming to save Africans from themselves and to introduce what they called the 3 C's, which was commerce, Christianity, and civilization. And then after agreeing upon the rules in which they could go in there and essentially, as long as you could force a local population under your will and you were the first European country to arrive on a piece of land, you could have that land for yourself. They set about through violence. We see that in the creation of the Congo Free State and what we now know as the Democratic Republic of Congo, where as a result of King Leopold's reign, about half the population were killed. That's about 10 million people. We see that violence in the divide and rule policies that were created, especially by the British, who created particularly large countries like the one that I'm in now, Nigeria, which has over 250 different languages and a multitude of ethnic groups. And they created these countries with as many different ethnic groups as possible to create as much instability as possible within these countries, to make it hard for these countries to exist beyond colonialism. And then we see it through, for example, the borders as well, these straight line borders that tore through ethnic groups. About 10% of all of the borders in Africa, about 30% of all the borders in Africa are simply just straight lines. And these split up about 10% of all ethnic groups across the region. And so you can imagine how devastating that would be for these communities. So fundamentally, it's important to remember that what the Berlin Conference did was that it created countries that were essentially built to fail. That's the legacy of the conference, and that's really what's important for people to understand today.
So the Berlin Conference has a huge impact on the continent of Africa, though it's not talked about. Researchers and experts have looked into documentation. They have looked at the impact of this particular conference to the people of the continent of Africa and the African institutions, the African's culture, the Africa's engagement, and as a continent on its own to stand on its feet. It's a wonderful system that put the continent in where it is today in a number of areas. I get it that African leaders and African nations should take responsibility for a number of areas. Of course they are, but we cannot ignore the importance and the impact, the implication of this particular conference that shaped the future of Africans, that the impact will be felt in centuries to come. That's the reason why a number of African leaders are pushing at the United Nations Security Council for a permanent seat and permanent veto power as well. And they are revising or pushing for the financial system to be revised. And they are pushing that African nations should have a voice. That's the reason why, as a result of these roadblocks that the continent officials, government experts are facing, they are going back to interact and meet with other nations like China or Russians who are providing an alternative, including India. Let me know what you think in regards to what the experts have discussed, and what do you think that the impact of the Berlin Conference is visible. If you know that the Berlin Conference had no impact in the continent of Africa, drop me a comment. But if you also feel that the Berlin Conference has a huge impact in the continent of Africa, I would also like to hear from you. For now, I want to thank you for watching. I will be looking forward to meeting you soon in our next episode. Smash the like button and have a wonderful day. Bye-bye.